Bonjour à tous.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this 54th edition of Vision du Réel. A few days ago, Jean-Stéphane asked me not to say too many nice things about him by way of introduction, so I will try to avoid doing that, but we're delighted to have him with us here at Vision du Réel. And obviously it's something which we should have done a long time ago. He's a filmmaker who inspires a lot of people and whose films and approach and perspective are exactly the type that we defend here at Vision du Réel. Well, he is both a national and an international star in Switzerland. There is also a guests journal, which you can find, copies of which you can find in many places, and which will enable you to discover some other avenues if you've missed the other masterclasses, which are also great. Now, for the first time in the history of Vision du Réel, we have a masterclass which is being translated in sign language as well as in English. So we are delighted that we have a sign language interpreter with us, which will open the doors to other people. So one last point. Apart from thanking Jean-Stéphane Bron for honoring us with his presence, we are delighted to present this retrospective. I would also like to thank Emmanuel Chicon, who's a member of the selection committee and has been for a number of years. I'm not allowed to say how many years, but he's been with us for many years, and he is an essential member of the selection committee, selecting the films which are shown in our program, which you will be able to see for another few days until the end of the week. I would like to thank the karaoke moderators who enabled us to have a very joyful day yesterday. I hope you enjoy the masterclass. Please go out and see some other films. There are plenty of films to see up until Saturday, and then on Sunday, of course, we will be projecting the winning film. First of all, there will be a brief excerpt, and then Jean-Stéphane, the floor will be yours.
Bonjour.
Good morning. Good morning to you. Good morning to everybody. I told you yesterday that I had prepared a little surprise. Well, it's not really a surprise, actually. Oh, no, I really didn't know, says Jean-Stéphane. I didn't know you were going to show this film, which I like very much. But you bumped into that person yesterday, did you not? Well, I really like this film, as I said, and this film that you just showed us. This is called an atelier, a workshop, and I think it's a much more appropriate word than masterclass. In an atelier about a film, or films, it's in a workshop, in an atelier, everyone realizes that there are tools and machines and that we have to make something. And therefore, it was much easier for me to understand this idea of a filmmaking factory. And then it's easier to understand how this workshop, even though some things remain, it's not always the same tools that are used to look at the same things in reality. So I tried to change. It's things which came from observation, from experience, which prompted me to reconfigure the workshop each time. And I did not decide to apply the same tools to do the same thing all the time. Obviously, you need different tools for different purposes. And as the person just said about science, you don't need the same tools to look at an ant or as you do to look at the moon. In this workshop, there's no plan, as all the documentary filmmakers know. But there is nevertheless a thought, an idea which precedes the film. And during these few minutes that we're going to be spending together, maybe we could link the atelier and the ideas which provide flesh to this workshop, this atelier. Emmanuel Chicon. Shall we call each other by our first names? Shall we tutoyer each other? Well, or do we have to say vous to each other? I don't know what you think. I don't know which we should use. We could pretend to say tu to each other. It's part of the game. Before arriving at this atelier, you mentioned le vert et le bleu. In your career, there is the figure of Iliasien, who is cited twice. He's an important figure. He's one of the figures who acted as one of your mentors, together with someone else who you were with at school. Could you maybe describe to us what brings us to the workshop that you mentioned? Brings you to the workshop that you mentioned a moment ago. Answer. Well, I was there with the brother of Vincent, who was the sound engineer for that film. So I had a very close-up view of the machines that you see there. Well, it's also a kind of workshop-type film. And there were all these sound reels which fell on the ground, and he started to cry about that. It was a really tragic moment, because he really had some difficulty in making the film. Why is he important? Well, because he made this film, which was a very important film in Switzerland for 2 generations, the Atelier de Fuc. It marked me a lot, it left its mark on me, and when he opened his cinema school in Lausanne, I registered there, and fortunately I was taken. And it's a person who, in fact, did not create a hierarchy between fiction and documentary film. He did a lot of fiction films and also a lot of documentaries. For that generation of filmmakers, it was fairly normal to switch from one to the other. Done documentaries, and for those filmmakers of that generation, there was a very normal transition that they often went through between fiction and documentary. That's why I think it's important. Yes, between documentary and fiction, but initially when you went into filmmaking, did you tend immediately towards documentary film? Or did you envisage the possibility of going to and fro between the two? Answer, well, no, it was really by chance. My diploma film was a documentary, and I felt at that time that it was an instrument that matched me, that corresponded to me. That was the first one, and then the second one, well, it was really a matter of chance. I had a strong intuition that there was a film to be made about the subject of my first feature-length film. So that was a path which I took pretty quickly, and I always admired greatly a documentary filmmaker called Richard Lindo. I had seen all his films in cinematheques and so on. I'd seen them over again. So I thought there was a possibility of exploring many things through documentary films because it's an interesting form. Emmanuel, how did you familiarize yourselves with films by going to the cinema, with cinematheques? Yes, both of those. When I was a child, of course, and then I went to a cinema school pretty early. You see a lot of films, and were they a kind of cauldron for you? Answer, well, Yes, at cinema school you see a lot of films, and before going to a cinematheque, 12 Chemin des Bruyères is your diploma film. It takes place in a building, and I have the impression that right from the word go, you invented a form of a place which would be yours for the rest of the film. A presence, not a body, but a presence, which becomes materialized. In 12 Chemin des Bruyères, the neighbors, these co-tenants. Was this something you intended to do right from the beginning, owing to the simplicity of the form? Answer, well, the aim was to start off very simply. For my first film, I thought it was a good idea to look around me, close by. I had another project. Maybe we're going to say something about the films which we did not end up making after all, because sometimes you can learn from failures. The cinema school is right next to a McDonald's, and there's a McDonald's drive there. And I wanted to do a film about the McDonald's people, but I was never allowed or permitted to do so. So after that, I said to myself, let's go to a place where it will be more or less possible to shoot the film. Emmanuel Chicon. So there's your diploma film, as we call it in Switzerland. What about the relationship with what was your relationship with the world of cinema? Cinema school gives you a foundation of knowledge, teaches you how to handle the tools that you will be using in a workshop. But you grew up with other personalities. You were part of a new wave of Swiss filmmakers, along with Ursula Mayer or Lionel Bayer. Ursula Mayer and Lionel Bayer, who trained by assisting Jacqueline Veuve. Which was more important for you? Answer, I was not expecting that question at all, says Jean-Stéphane. Well, I think there was a generational gap. There had been the generation of filmmakers that had made Swiss cinema, and they had exported many films. Salamandre in France attracted 1 million admissions, and they had some films which won awards at the major film festivals. And then we had the new wave, Swiss new wave, Nouvelle Vague. And then there were not really any successors to that. So I think that the Yassin school filled a gap for people like major technicians and sound engineers. So we started to work together very quickly. And the Yassin conceived of this as a kind of school of the different professions, editing, sound and light. The idea being that one had to know everything, one had to get to know more or less everything. So that was the philosophy of the school. It was not just a place where we went to make films. We also learned a lot of technical things which were often quite useful to me. Handling a camera? Well, no, in fact, not handling the camera. It's a trick question. In fact, I became a film director because I did not do much on the technical side. I realized that there were other people who were much better able than me to handle the camera. And some people who were excellent at that. I was with people who were excellent at that. So the school was more like, the 4 years I spent at school was a place in which we did some crazy things. We spent months building decors and lighting systems and scenes. It was a place at which you could meet people. Fairly creative place. during the first 2 years at school there were not really many rules or anything like that, so we had fun. Question: when you left school, you had to start to build your workshop and get together the first tools and to conceive of your first film. Could you tell us something about what launched you out in the cinema landscape, initially in Switzerland and subsequently over and beyond our borders? Connu de nos services, known to our departments, which came out in about 1997, I think, and which was projected on the Piazza Grande in Locarno, I believe. We were talking about this to prepare this atelier together with known to our departments, Connu de nos services. What story did you want to narrate and how? Because when one seeks to tell a story as a documentary or filmmaker or fiction filmmaker, or which is your case, between the two, what was the initial idea? Was it Claude Muret? Answer: well, I found out that he was also a filmmaker because he found it on the generic of Ursula Mayer film. Oh no, it's or was it the Blocher film? Well, this is the Red Lion. I was working on. I was asked to work on a Christine Pascal film, and that's how I met Claude Muret, and we became good friends. And there I met all the people who were going to become very important for me, because the producer of the film and the husband of Christine was Robert Bonnet, who had produced Les Petites Fugues. So I found myself there making this film and traveling between France and Switzerland as an electrician. That was my role there. So it was by chance that I was there. I met Claude Muret by chance, and then occasionally we saw each other, and then by chance, one evening we had to meet each other. We were supposed to meet each other. He had just received these political data sheets, as they're known in Switzerland, and he was quite emotional after having read all these political data sheets, which the police in Switzerland had compiled both at the cantonal and at the national level in Switzerland over a period of 30 or 40 years. They had drawn up all these data sheets on the left wing and far left wing in Switzerland, and that meant that about 10% of the population had these sheets compiled about them. But very few people had made the request to receive the original reports from the cantons. It was a pile of documents like this, and he had read and reread his life through these documents. And when he talked to me, I thought to myself, that could be the subject matter for a film. Now, obviously, we know that the word documentary comes from document, the word document, and here there were some documents. But there were many things which he had forgotten, but which he could read again in these documents. So he was in a paradoxical situation. On the one hand, he was shocked by everything that had been written down about him, but at the same time, he was quite grateful for this opportunity to these policemen and women for giving him the opportunity to read all these details, some of which he had forgotten, including conversations about his mother, which had been written down like cinema dialogues. The mother says, and then the answer, and so on. So I found this material was pretty incredible. It's like a script, says Emmanuel Chicon. Well, it started in 1964. It ended in the 70s. And it started when he was aged 18 and ended when he got married, which was a marriage of convenience, which was to enable his wife to get residence papers for Switzerland. The idea was to show people that he was a dilettante, and there was a whole lot of information about the subject and about his personality. So I thought this could be a documentary. At the origin of this documentary, there were cops So it took a lot of work to find and convince the policeman who had written these documents. But there was a difference between them and the people who were doing the surveillance at the time. There are some sequences which are quite droll. And form a kind of receptacle for revolutionary activities. But you had all those people who appeared face to the camera, people from that time who appeared face to the camera. Then there's your voice, which narrates what is not going to be, which is not going to be recounted by the characters about various avenues. And the people who did surveillance on them are treated in two different ways. Either it's the moustache that talks with a bit like a secret conversation, something like that. And then there's this other cop from Lausanne, I believe. Hartmann, was that his name? Who, in contrast, agrees to appear in the image. You show him in the image on an equal foot.
Yes, this was a part of the reality, in fact, because first of all, these police officers didn't want to be known. They worked secretly for many, many years, and they didn't want to all of a sudden appear. And when we opened up these data sheets, this was a real shock for the population in general. It was incredible because, in fact, Switzerland all of a sudden was not on the good side of the Iron Curtain. Yes, it was in other places that we were familiar with these police practices, and we all of a sudden noticed that all of a sudden here things were similar to countries like Argentina and so on. So they didn't want to be known, and I thought it was excellent that this should be a sort of a core, an unidentified core that is explaining what their techniques were. And Hartmann, since Hartmann was somebody who was known by the militants, he was very well known. So it was quite natural. He agreed to be filmed, and the others didn't have masks. We just could see their eyes, in fact. And so this idea was born from this situation. And afterwards, I thought it was entirely normal. Because this is a film that I can say this now, in fact, but the Dindo films, I had the Dindo films in mind, memory films, and Dindo's principle was to say that that is where film is where all of the ghosts come back. It's linked up to death and the disappeared, and this is where where film can redo what has been. What is past, what is over. That's the idea of Dindo. You can have a movie on Rimbaud, for example, because all you have to have is the Rimbaud, the letters from Rimbaud and Rosalie, and then you can recruit actors when you have the real text, and they're going to actually say this. So his entire work is based on the idea that cinema is there to live and bring back what has passed, what is gone. And so, since I was a fan, and real fan, well, I didn't actually think it like this, but I all of a sudden had this opportunity to make this film where memory was at the core of it, and what should have disappeared had actually been saved by the police officers, and how Claude was supplementing these sheets, these files that were very dry, and I decided to read them. I knew that I would be the reader from the very outset. That's how I discovered these. And Claude would be one of the main characters, where most of it would be the spoken word, and that is what invited us to create these ideas, these images. And if these words were properly selected, and if we could film them properly, for the first take, I remember this, it was 25 years ago, I think, but I still remember this very well. I received a whole pile of these data sheets in complete form, and I think that we probably had to run that sequence 50 times until the light was just right, until the rhythm was suitable, proper, because I knew that Dindo used to have many shots, have people speak the way he wanted them to speak, the way he heard them the first time. And he would often say to people, well, what if we replace this word with that one? And that was trying, in fact, to, wasn't betraying them at all. It was just trying to get them to say in the deepest possible way. And that was the work of the director. And it was to try to prompt people to come up with something that was going to help us to really go into their minds. Well, for you, the spontaneity of the documentary films is something that can be constructed, can be worked on. Well, yes, it can be, but not always. Sometimes we're actually seeking for jumping forwards or backwards, I don't know. But the other day I missed a sequence, a shot, completely. I'm doing a film right now that's related to this. This was a movie lover, very strong movie lover, and at this person's place, a very small apartment, and she had put on a dress from the 50s and had bought flowers that went very well with the dress. So I couldn't ask her to change, but I had actually imagined, well, we had said that she has to be free in her flat. She has a series, there's a library on François Truffaut, the Japanese film, and we just said we're going to let her be free, completely free. And because of that dress she was wearing, certain things were impossible. And I was thinking that we're going to give her a little neck microphone. That way she'll be very free and we'll just follow her. But because of this dress that had no openings at all, we couldn't place our microphone anywhere because of the dress. So all of a sudden I was completely, nothing worked, basically. So we spent 2 hours on this. And 2 days later, we thought, we failed completely on this. It just didn't work. And we said, we'll go back to her and ask her to put on a dress that would allow us to have her walk freely in her apartment, and I could just interact with her in a very free way. Just to tell you that it depends on what you want, what you're looking for. For her personality, this is what she wanted to do. So we failed miserably on that one, and we had to do it over. Now, for Claude, the idea was to, through these files or data sheets, we had to be very careful about the time that Claude had to retell this. It was a sort of a monologue, and he was just talking in a way that made it possible for us to film, and it was appropriate for this. Yes, because there's a very close correspondence between the core of the police, the Hartmann figure, for example, put forward, and there's the Muret character, tragic, and the other militants with whom he worked. So you often, almost always, have this equidistant rapport between you and the characters, but also the characters among themselves. Yes, quite true. If I go back to Yersin, it was about the height of the elevation or height of the camera, It was very rigorous work. He could see immediately when the camera was a little bit above the eye level or below. And if the camera was 1 centimeter below eye level, then he would say, why is it 1 centimeter below? So when we're trying to do a close-up portrait, and if you're a little bit above or below, it changes things, of course. If you're filming somebody from below, it's very different from above. It has a different meaning, and it's true that people are always filmed in general at the same level. This is something that I've been doing for a number of years now. When we have fixed optical systems, we're able to have a mid-height shot or a shot at the eye level, but we have to be at the same distance between each character, which a zoom doesn't allow you to do. Now, you can film from one particular place with a zoom, but in this case, we have to move around. I don't know if what I'm saying is clear, but when you have fixed systems, you have a zoom. Yes, you can zoom in, zoom out. But when you have a fixed optical system, if you want to have a close-up, you have to be at exactly the same distance. I've been doing this now in a number of films because I am able to have the type of camera that does this. Okay, we're now going to move along and go more and more into our workshop by mentioning your second film, which is called La Bonne Conduite, the way I look at you. Another way of doing the work with known by our departments, that film is to film from, which is filmed somewhere. I mentioned the Chemin des Bruyères, very close to where you live, in fact, your neighbors. And then there's this process of retrospection, what has happened in Switzerland, where you grew up. In fact, it's the generation, your parents' generation, Claude Muret, approximately. Yes, well, yes, just sort of in between. But there is this generational rapport, what happened in this country where I grew up. I was not necessarily aware of this, the whole business of the surveillance. And with this film, La Bonne Conduite, the way I look at you, it's something which is new, and we're going to have an excerpt now on this. First, before we go back to the workshop, could we have the excerpt number 2?
Vous avez l'espoir, vous, de retourner une fois dans votre pays?
Ah ouais, beaucoup, ouais.
Ouais.
Ouais. Bon, si on lit l'histoire de l'Afghanistan, il y a eu toujours la guerre.
Ouais?
Ouais. Il y a eu toujours la guerre.
Puis après, vous vous êtes retrouvés en Suisse, là. Les contacts étaient encore plus difficiles, ou bien?
Disons que, je sais pas, depuis que je suis en Suisse, j'ai pas rencontré beaucoup de Suisses.
C'est vrai?
C'est plutôt des étrangers, ouais.
Non.
Ouais.
Dans votre travail, là, vous rencontrez
Dans mon
surtout
travail,
des étrangers?
ouais.
Ah, ben où est-ce qu'il faut aller chercher ces Suisses?
Je sais pas, moi je crois qu'il y en a pas beaucoup. Hein.
Ouais. Ils vous ouvrent pas leurs portes comme ça. Ou la porte de leur cœur, mais ou de leur maison, ça vient pas comme ça.
Non, je sais pas moi, mais...
Quand vous parlez, vous oubliez de conduire un petit peu. Hein.
Oui,
Ouais,
ça,
un petit peu là. Et à part ça, je vous ai fait un parcours compliqué.
Oh, j'étais pas très en forme non plus parce que...
Non.
Ouais.
Vous n'aviez pas assez dormi?
Non, disons que ça fait longtemps que j'ai pas reçu de nouvelles de mes parents aussi, et puis ça m'agace un peu, ouais.
C'est sûr que ça doit vous inquiéter, hein, quand même.
Oui, ça m'inquiète un peu, quoi. Mais disons que cette situation, j'en ai vu tellement que maintenant c'est devenu un peu normal, mais ça...
Ouais, bah quand même, hein.
Oui, ça va.
Ça serait mieux d'avoir des nouvelles. Hein.
Bah ouais, c'est sûr. À la
Faut
fin de
espérer,
Noël,
garder l'espoir. Hein.
Bah ouais, ça c'est clair.
Puis écrire, vous pouvez écrire.
Oui, disons que j'ai eu de nouvelles parce que mon père, tous les mois, il m'envoie 1 ou 2 lettres au mois, quoi. Ouais. Ça fait 6 ou 7 mois que j'ai pas rien reçu.
Oh là
Par contre,
là.
j'ai beaucoup envoyé des lettres.
Ouais,
Alors ça me fait un petit peu, comment on dit?
ça fait des soucis. Hein.
Ouais.
Et ça me fait mal au cœur. Ça me fait mal au cœur. Mais bah, je ne sais pas tellement que faire pour venir à son secours. Hein. Je souhaite qu'il se crée une famille, que ce soit chez lui ou ici, mais de pas rester seul comme ça. Vous me direz, moi je suis seule aussi, mais c'est pas pareil quand même. Oh non, parce que moi je sais pas, on a toute une famille autour. Suivant ce qui se passe, il est seul là. Hein. Moi je trouve que c'est dur comme vie.
On parle beaucoup de... Moi, je parle beaucoup de ma vie, et puis elle parle beaucoup de sa vie. On explique des choses, mais on ne se comprend pas totalement, quoi. Tu vois?
Alors quand on discutait...
So when we were talking while we were preparing this workshop, we mentioned the concept of the perimeter. And I think that this perimeter is also a geographic perimeter, and it's very important in that film. The way I look at you, it was shot in an area which is very limited, I think. Can you tell us a little bit about what you wanted to do? And perhaps you could start to tackle the question of casting, because there are 5 couples that we see here. They're dysfunctional, these couples. Sometimes it's a comical situation, sometimes it's tragic. I'm thinking of this Portuguese woman who absolutely has to get her driver's license, and it's very poignant, I think. And there are other characters, as we see in the one where there is somebody who has repeated failures, and there's a Vietnamese instructor who tells her absolutely nothing about the things she needs to know about the driving, but tells her about breathing techniques and so on. So how do you connect with the characters? How does the casting go? Do you spend a lot of time with them? Do you discuss things with them before you bring in a camera in a very limited area? Well, it's true that this is a film that sort of has come towards me with Claude. This is something very different that's developing here. I think the idea of the concept of the character, if there's a protagonist, and here these are people who actually want something. At the center of this system, there is a will, there's a need. Everyone wants to get this driver's license, so we have all wanted to pass the tests, and this is something that's easy to understand. It's simple. We know that at the end, it will be an exam, there will be a test, and the result of this will be obtaining or not a driver's license. So a character here in this case is somebody who needs or wants something. It's very simple. It's the tragic hero. It's just Aristotle. There are obstacles, and so here we have students, the Swiss or not Swiss, foreigners. And so for the casting, well, we were in these vehicles. We had to do an enormous amount of research, because even before we started filming, I could say quite concisely what was at stake every time. So there are 5 separate stories. There is a football player in Yverdon, semi-professional, but at the same time who was a teacher, driving teacher, replaced in the team by a Brazilian player who had been bought and has to teach him how to drive. So here we had a situation that was ambiguous, difficult for him, and every time I knew what was at stake, and we had actually looked for these stories. So we didn't know what would happen before we started filming, whether they'd get this license or the driver's license or not. It's the story of a woman who had tried and failed 5 times, and she meets a Vietnamese instructor, and there's a philosophical exchange there, and this helps her. And then there's the whole issue of the perimeter was not so much a geographical perimeter, but the perimeter, the outlines of the film, strictly speaking, is what is at stake, what is involved. And here it's how are people really meeting. So it was filming or capturing this exchange, this dialogue. So this is a film, and I think it's interesting because it's a film that we could not have done 6 months earlier, for example, because we had very small cameras that arrived on the market, Sony cameras that were this big, very small, and we could literally place them on the dashboard inside the vehicle. It would have been much too complicated for those who have attached cameras to the outside of vehicles. It takes too much time, so it was impossible to have the cameras placed outside. So it was the only kind of camera that allowed us to be 80 centimeters away, yet a triangular thing. We didn't want a wide angle because the wide angle deformed people's faces completely. So that way the perspective was intact, straight lines were intact. It was the only sort of camera. It had just been developed, it was available, we made some tests, so the whole point was to have a camera which was placed in front of the student driver and in front of the instructor. And so that was that was the heart of the film, the core of the film. And we were going to then develop the dialogues, and afterwards we find people where they live, for example, they're filmed where they live and so on. The film could have been done even more radically and rigorous on these 2 shots exclusively. Yes, but with this perimeter that you're talking about, that you just mentioned, this field, this system that made it possible to capture a situation on the fly, which is very limited because the students, of course, have to focus a little bit on the road, which of course leads to some fairly funny scenes because they're caught up in the conversation. But you're never there as a director. You're never there on the scene when these conversations take place. Yes, I was sitting behind. That was very dangerous, but that's part of what I wanted to do. Yes, very dangerous thing to do, but I was actually lying down behind them on the back seat. Yes, like a cat. Indeed, indeed, yes. And I was watching the sound, so I had a headset. So I think that was critical, actually, very important, because for the first time you don't have somebody behind the camera, but somebody has to be there, because that is, well, something I'm really convinced about. It changes everything. Because everyone knows that we're making a film. They're little by little becoming familiar with the subject, the topic, and so there is something that changes. There's some chemistry that's that's altered by my presence, because they know that we are filming their relationship, and it involves people who are from Switzerland, people who come from other countries. Is that how you introduced the idea of the film to them? No, not at all. We don't say everything. We don't tell them everything. We tell them a lot, but not everything. Because, and I think it's important to have at least some portion remain unsaid, not completely explained, because otherwise I have the feeling that they're not actually going to do the film, because we would be, if you had a program which had to be applied, people would be too self-conscious perhaps about what they're supposed to say and what to do. I think you said at one point, I don't know what the source was, but you said that when somebody approaches you and when you are facing, when you're looking for people, real people who are going to be characters in films and who are going to be transformed. I think it's Johan van der Keken who said that as soon as you put a camera somewhere, well, there's a force field which is created, and this force field actually changes the situation between the people behind the camera, people on the other side of the camera, and conversations perhaps that you manage to capture with people who are being filmed. And you said that when I begin a film, when I start a film and somebody comes to me, I'm looking for my my people, and when a possible hero comes to me and says, well, you use me, I love to be filmed, well, you should run away. Well, here there was press. I don't know how many instructors there are in this part of Switzerland, but I was being a little bit careful about this. And it is true that when people want to be filmed, you have to be filmed, you have to be a little bit careful, because there's something that's a little bit unnatural in that. And there should be something difficult in the approach. And there's a sort of a meeting point that needs to be sought and found. And if you don't have a little bit of resistance at the beginning, or perhaps shyness, I think it creates transparency. It actually, there are many people on television, on the television screen. I think that when we want to do this work, this approach, and things are a little bit difficult, and we have to convince people and try to establish a rapport, confidence, trust, rapport, that's when we can come up with something where we work together, we can begin to talk about the subject in the film and be very honest and transparent about this. I remember that in this film we were talking about, well, somebody had to be replaced in the team, and was a little bit bitter about that. It was very difficult for that individual to be replaced. Well, replaced in the football team, so had literally been set aside, was a bench warmer, and I felt that the person was extremely uncomfortable. And this individual was overacting, pretending that everything was fine and everything. But I said, we understand very well how you feel. So the fact that we did shoot a scene then, and he said, it's difficult for me to be replaced in a team, I'm jealous, and so on. And for him to all of a sudden be in that position saved the situation. We understood better why he was tense in the car, in the vehicle. So if we create this, if we have to go and try to find this, it's difficult. I think it'd be more interesting afterwards.
When you construct a film like The Way I See You, you're obviously placed there in the car. But depending on what is narrated and what might interest you, maybe it's not the right tone, or in this particular case, the shooting was almost unique. There was no way of reshooting it. No, I don't remember doing that. No, but sometimes we did. I did provoke a conversation, a kind of triangular conversation, and then when the conversation had been launched, I kind of lay down on the seat. There was always something like that about something which had just been said, or an exchange, or something which had happened, and I thought it was possible to do that. But this Brazilian football player, after a few weeks, he was no longer alone. He was in a relationship, and then Thierry wasn't there. So there were lots of factors which could have made the situation more difficult. So we often did start conversations, but I'm not really present myself, except in some sentences which picked up on. I said things like, "Are you sure?" The idea being to elicit certain confessions. Maybe I did ask little questions. But you nevertheless have an idea of what you want to do, which direction you want to head in. Yes, Emmanuel Chican The idea was to see what the culture shocks can be in a country and in a certain situation. Jean-Stéphane Bron, we did a casting of for the story. I was with Lionel Bayer, who was very young at that time, and we took the phone directory, and we really had gone through the whole list from A. The first person was called Ebischer, then Abdel, I don't know who. We went right down to Z in the canton of Vaud. And then when we'd done the canton of Vaud, we continued with Geneva in order to find stories. We had met hundreds of instructors. It was not just a matter of finding one instructor. We had to find a duo. So the casting took a long time. Question as regards the time scale of the film. The approach to the story that you had in mind was pretty long, was it not? Answer, well, the idea was to really find stories. I could not discover these stories by shooting. If we'd not adopted this approach, I would still be shooting even today. So you really had to have this little relationship which creates a new approach. The idea was that each person should be sanctioned if necessary. The idea was that we should really go right up to the exam, and then some people would pass, some people would fail. And there was one couple, an African woman, who was taking her driving test without having told her husband, so she was doing it in secret, and the instructress showed a lot of solidarity with her, but it was not very easy for that person to drive. And then we had to stop, in fact. We had to stop filming. We had to give up. But I had 5 stories which were ready. When we started shooting, we already had all our protagonists. Then came the editing stage. During the editing stage, were you completely focused and concentrated on the subject, or could you imagine the next stage? When you were editing The Way I Look at You, were you already thinking about what, for example, the film called Corn in Parliament? Known to our services, we shot it in a conventional way, the same way for The Way I Look at You, but it was the next film where I put in place everything. I did the editing during shooting, so we did some shooting and then editing. We took breaks in the shooting for some editing. But initially we did things in a very conventional way. We shot everything and then did the editing. So there is a very limited space. You have spatial constraints. The film, for me, was about how people look at each other, how people look at one another. Question. Once you come out of the home environment, there are some forms of retrospection about what has happened, other not. And there again, you construct a triangular configuration, because as the viewer, you're in a situation of connivance with the various characters, and you know in the film what the other protagonists don't necessarily know. Are you talking about The Way I Look at You? Yes. This maybe something like that which will come into play. Jean-Stéphane Bron. Well, what I like about The Way I Look at You is that they don't all do it, but you have to also see the tragic side of an encounter. You spend a lot of time together. For me, it was a bit like a metaphor for human encounters in general. One can often share something at a distance, and one tries to understand one another. But she was very much into being helpful and benevolent, and she was really wanted to care for him. And there's something between the two. He says it. He puts it very well. He says we cannot completely understand a tragic situation which we have not experienced ourselves. You can try to understand it thanks to witnesses, but you cannot completely understand it. So there's something like that which bonds us, but it also separates us as well, irremediably. Question. But it's still in a social situation in the passenger compartment of a car. Answer. Yes, the starting point was an SSR competition about multiculturalism, and for me it was a kind of observation, and I was interested because I was not in a multiculturalism specialist, but it was great for me to be with people who are confronted with multiculturalism every day. And it was in a kind of natural situation, not in an asylum seekers center, for example. Asylum seekers hostel was a bit like in a kind of studio, the situation we were in. Next film, you aimed your microscope, as it were, at something which is more like a subject which is more like the macrocosm. There you took an interest in what happens in the wings of the Swiss Parliament building in Bern with your film Corn in Parliament, which was one of your box office hits. That was your first feature-length film. It's more than 90 minutes long, and you appear with the spotlight on you in cinemas, and you become an important filmmaker thanks to that film. Of course, it's important that the film itself should be seen by a lot of people, but was your aim also to create a kind of pedagogical public space? Well, that success was despite myself. I don't think anyone would have bet that a film about parliamentary commissions in which people are talking about a law concerning genetic engineering in Switzerland, no one would have guessed it would have been so successful. Was it easy to film for you? Well, not necessarily, but I wanted to make a film at in the Parliament building, and I wanted there to be a tense subject, and it was a building which is not very accessible to everybody. This was the initial idea that we had. It's not something that we discovered as we went along. The idea was that we should be in the wings, kind of off stage, backstage, and people will come out of the commission meeting rooms and then they will relate to us what happened in the meeting room. So it's this off screen which they recount to us, which will make our imagination work. And we really had this idea of that something would happen on stage, and then the actors would come off stage, and then they would tell us what they have just experienced. Question. We're now going to see a sequence. It's excerpt number 3, Giuseppe. If we could see excerpt number 3.
Auf unserer Seite haben wir eine schlechte Präsenz heute Nachmittag. Mehrheitsverhältnis.
Didn't go so well today. We could have won a majority with 13 votes against 12. But many people were absent. We really had to talk for a long time so as to avoid further votes, which we might have lost. So we had to resort to filibustering. And at the end of the debate, in the last hour, we did a lot of filibustering, but the others noticed it, and they tried to strike back. I have another debate organized tomorrow, but what is at stake is not so important. You have to be there. It's always important to be present. Often the vote's carried by one vote, and if someone's not there, it's irrecuperable. You can never go back on that. We hope that tomorrow Nerank will be there. He's an important ally. He was absent for health reasons. I hope it's not a serious health problem. Of course, we need him for that vote. He's sick. I believe he's in hospital. He's not here. We're just missing one person to get the majority. I don't know how he voted. I don't think he voted with us, I assume. I don't know. I don't know him so well. If he had been present, we are 6 radicals. FDP, there are 5 SVPs, there's 1 liberal, and Czech Nerank often votes with us, and that would make just 13. It's always very tight. It's always very tight. Rudy, you don't even know. Listen to me. We will never know how much the authorization I'm looking for costs. You cannot anticipate all the impacts of GMO. That's why we have to do research. And we've just destroyed everything, and you're going to bear the responsibility for that. You're dramatizing this, but you're not on target. There are only 3 enterprises in Switzerland. Now it concerns 40. 100 years ago, it was the same story with electricity. No, I don't want them to put pressure on the agricultural market with their products. In the 1970s, the Socialist Party wanted to prevent computers. Wanted to prevent computers from being used. And you, in the 1980s, you got it all wrong with the real estate sector. And in the 1990s, it was the new economy. And now, don't go off like that.
Mit einer Stimme Unterschied. So.
By a difference of 1 vote. He was very annoyed. It was funny. Well, not really funny. He cannot lose. And afterwards I told him. I was a bit nasty. The FDP is not accustomed to losing. We, the Greens, we are accustomed to that. He has to accept it. He never stopped coming back with old proposals. He really insisted. He really had difficulty digesting this. Just couldn't believe it. You okay? You're not happy? This part has to be removed. I've told him very clearly. I've told her very clearly, if she removes that, we will adopt the rest, but no more than that. For disseminations, we won't introduce science. This is going to go to the plenary. We'll make it. We have to take another look at paragraph B. We will make an individual proposal. There's also the second reading. There, we will not be able to do very much. It'll be okay. Well, we're really in an incredible situation for him. This is very unusual for him, because on the one hand, he's convinced of technological progress, and that it's a good thing. But due to the environment that he lives in, well, on the other hand, he has his former employers behind him, and they're pushing him to document this. But he, strictly speaking, cannot do anything because they don't have a majority on this subject. I believe they've imagined that it could be quite difficult or laborious, that there would be a lot of discussion. But to lose on each and every one of the proposals, I don't think he ever imagined that. He will learn. He would be, or is he too old to learn? Even at age 65, you have to be able to learn. At the beginning of my life, I often used to lose. I often lost. I come from a family which had very little prestige. We lived in very modest conditions. My father, when I was born, he was 60 years old. I'm a straggler. I was probably not a planned baby. I had a natural character of a gang leader, and I did quite a few stupid things. I was called the hooligan of the group, the hooligan of the village, the racketeer from up there. And when I was 12 or 13 years old, if someone had asked me, who wants to bet on young Randiger, no one would have invested a penny in me. No one would have bet a penny in me. Maybe the pastor. That's all. Of course. At the beginning, I used to lose a lot. And maybe at the end, I will be losing again. But at least I will have fought. At least I will have fought. So the Swiss Parliament building is a priori either impressive or not very attractive. Now here you focus on a strong representation, a strong portrayal of the body politic. People who are accustomed to being shown in the media, they're accustomed to being surrounded by cameras with very careful framing and with pre-prepared speeches which are read off and then immediately forgotten. But you and your team, because it is a team, you adopt the opposite approach. The body politic is a body, and characters are also bodies, and you wanted to stage all this. You wanted to put all this on stage when you conceived of making a film about the work of this famous parliamentary commission. As it happened, it was on genetic engineering, but it could have been about any other problem. Jean-Stéphane Bron, well, we just chose a complex issue in a big machine, which was being handled by a big machine. It was maybe a surprising choice, but it's a question we can all understand, the question of GMOs. But to come back to the tools, Initially, I had another operator who was quite small, and I realized that all the members of that commission were quite tall. And we started with him. And so we had shots which were from below, angled upwards. So I found an excuse to have him replaced. Then I found an operator who was very tall. It's a film which is with a sound rod. There's no HF. It was a sound boom which was about 4 or 5 meters long at the time. So we agreed very well on the choreography. Even for the very small movements, we found some movements when people went out. We found a way to reposition ourselves, and in our imagination, the idea was to place people one opposite another. People were opposite one another, so a bit like in a theatre, so that we could create the fourth wall. When I was alone with people and interacting, it didn't matter too much if we had to keep passing the microphone around. So there were some scenes which were giving a transparency effect. We pretended not to exist. You can see the examples when they are discussing among themselves and plotting. That's really direct cinema, is it not? Says Emmanuel Chicon. Yes. And when they were off screen, the operator said yes, because often he had not really understood what they were saying. I understood what they were saying, especially with their body language was very clear. You did not need to understand what they were saying. You could understand from their body language. One said, plenum, we will be going to the second reading. He's understood, he's realized that he's going to lose, and that's what we're going to see. So in fact, we prepare this, and I can remember quite clearly that every evening I drew the dramaturgy. I said to myself, Mirank is not going to be there, so the other one's going to win. There was another person, Liliane Chapuis, who was from the Socialist Party, whose function was really to summarize the situation. Her role was to summarize the situation. She was less a protagonist and more someone who proposes the issues so that we can understand them. We named the people who were missing. The main conflict was between Maya and Randegger. They were the main protagonists. So we could see that the whole film was going to be shot for about 1 hour, 10 minutes behind this door with the play and going to and fro. Moderator, before showing this excerpt, we said that this was the first time that you had a system with your tools which enabled you to edit while you were shooting. That's what you described a few moments ago. When you come back from shooting and you jot some notes down on a piece of paper, this is what's at stake. Then you gave fairly precise instructions to the chief operator and also to some characters maybe as well, did you not? Because on the one hand there's the live filming aspect, but there's maybe also the risk of overplaying. Of being over manipulatory, but in the positive sense of the word. And I believe for some scenes you do a lot of takes, do you not? No, not for everything. When we had to set out the issues, and I told people we have to be extremely precise, especially about the issue of the moratorium. We have to understand each other. We put people back to the wall and we asked them to look directly at the camera, and they really had to address the viewers so as to set out the issues. And I did this with Randegger and with Maya Graf mainly. That was the nature of the action. The idea was, well, it was a bit like a tragedy. The idea was that the character should develop through the action. Moderator, they really were being filmed in motion, were they not? Jean-Stéphane Bron. well, things have changed since then, but at the time, our model was the television model, which is a very staid model, and but we said to ourselves we have to break away and do something else. Well, we were quite young at the time. We won people's trust because we were young. They just thought we were students, basically inoffensive, harmless students. So you played on that, did you not, as a moderator? Well, maybe we were a bit naive and innocent. But we really wanted to understand. The question was, what's happening today? Are you okay? We did this very actively. We set the issues very precisely. A character is someone who wants something, who has an objective to achieve. Randiger, well, for Randiger, we set as few rules as possible. We were as liberal as possible with him, Randiger. There were some others for whom there were more rules. That was clear from the outset. In this moment of confession, moderator, I believe that's one of the only ones in the film, is it not? Well, the other two moments were fairly clear, says the filmmaker. They were two farmers. There's José Kunz as well. Well, it took quite a long time to persuade one of the protagonists to be shown with the UDC, because that person said, if some of my voters see that I'm with the UDC, that will be terrible. So they came a long way with me. I thought Randiger was interesting because when you're talking about a character, there are two things. There's what the character wants, and there's also what the character needs. So you have to Aristotle was Freud, and there's this notion of saying it's not just the question of the tragic events which happen to the hero, but there's also the hero's own intimate tragedy. And in this particular case, it was interesting for someone who was about to lose, because in the end he was going to win. So it was interesting to see why he always wanted to win. So here it was more what he needs to win. It was not interesting for everyone. For him, it was interesting because it was a matter of breaking an old prejudice. It was kind of the cowboy with a black hat in a Western. It was not a way of saving him, but a way of exploring this other facet to his character.
Well, we often have this as a political thriller, sometimes a Western. But in any case, a documentary film, to be sure, but which uses the narration from fiction. Is that something that you had in mind from the very outset? And that you are showing this in the opening scene with the parting curtains, almost magical. We don't see anybody who's doing this, but this is something which is transparent and talking about the primary identification of a spectator. But I think that this works also when you're dealing with a documentary project. Well, it's true that these are people who have been characterized from the very outset. The opening scene of the film was at the very end and was actually shot at the very end. But since we knew them very well, then we could find one action that defined each one so that the viewer could know exactly where he or she would stand. So this is the theater where things are going to develop. So this is very conventional parliament. The year was very important because I think that if this is seen in 50 years or whatever, it would be very different. So the amount of time that we spent there as well was very important. This was important information for the viewer. 1 year was spent. It was a year. Now this is a concept that's important. In the other film, the way I look at you was unimportant, but here this was something that was very important at the very beginning, very functional, and then the characters afterwards, in a very conventional way, they want something, and it shows how they are going to be blocked, and they're not going to be able to get what they want by many people. So there's that first stage, and then there's the second stage where things open up, we are in the actual parliament, and we move away from it and we see the tragedy. Now the visual regime then, the moderator speaking, is completely different from what we saw earlier. It's about 2/3 of the film, no, probably a little more than a little over half of the film, which is direct filming, speaking directly to viewers. One gets the impression that when the various characters address you, this, as a spectator, puts us in a very privileged position that we don't usually have vis-à-vis the work which involves the way in which the political system works in a democracy. We're excluded from this often. And here we find ourselves really at the very core, the melting core of this reactor, this crucible, right where the action is, in other words. And this allows us, through primary identification, to say, the one who represents me, well, I could be doing that role, and what would be at stake for me here? How would I manage in this intrigue? Would I be able to be successful here? And then the second part, we have everything which is at stake. We know more or less what each person's score is, if you will. And here we can't repeat things anymore. It has to really be followed by almost like a musical score. Can you tell us a little bit about the way you have constructed this second sequence, where the point of view, we become omniscient as viewers, because you're working on angles and as a way of stylizing a vote, which everyone knows when we've seen pictures on channels that show what's going on in Parliament. That's not at all how things happen. In fact, it's much more boring. It's much more slow. Or sometimes in France, actually, it's very active. Well, yes, first part, there's this principle that we observe. There's trust, confidence is built. And then in the second part, which is actually shot in the actual Parliament area, room, we were very lucky to be able to set ourselves up set our cameras up there. They accepted to have us there one day, and overnight we had to, for the operatives, it was extremely complicated to do this. There were many of them, and we had to move away from this unique point of view about the relationship, and to get some height and some distance, and to be able to see how the end of this drama would unfold, the denouement, if you will. So in the first part, there was strength, the Mayograph, the Camp 1, in this case, the left. Afterwards, there was a pressure of lobbies, the extremely significant activity to try to turn this vote around, which is generally followed in the, because the commission is like a mini parliament, and then this long work as the parliamentary commissions is done. I heard many times, commission so-and-so has finished its work, and now we move to the vote. But the liberal right did not accept the result of the commission, and it did an enormous amount of extremely powerful lobbying to overturn this. I was extremely fortunate, because something which normally happens very swiftly became something where there was a lot at stake. a real challenge. And we had to capture this and make sure that we could have this understood, and showing how is this vote going to be overturned. And then the drama unfolded, so we changed our approach completely. There were several cameras. I was still the speaking partner, interlocutor of everyone, but we had people in different places to try to capture and to try to use all of the techniques of cinema that we had available to make sure that we covered all of the angles, the difficulties waiting for the vote, and there were many of these. So this is something which is not realistic. In fact, the way time becomes contracted in this way, where cinema tries to capture this situation, suspense, and so on. In your workshop, the moderator speaking, you prepare a lot of material, but you're also very lucky. Did this happen, this interaction between preparation, but then while you're shooting, there are things that happen that you did not predict or forecast would happen? Well, yes, I'm very lucky. If you're not lucky, then it's an occupational problem. In this commission, in fact, there was another representative of the Green Party who left, and then Maya Graff arrived, so it wasn't the same film without her after she left. All of a sudden, the film was different. So all of a sudden, there was a face, a voice, energy. So things changed there, and so we were lucky, in fact, because this particular commission with these particular characters. It did happen very often that one was lucky, or actually one was unlucky, and that led to something as well. We'll see that later, of course, but there's a film that I wanted to make, which I didn't actually manage to make, but I had this idea of turning the situation around, and we're going to discover that now, in fact. Let's move now to an excerpt. I think we're going to go straight to excerpt number 5.
Do you swear the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes.
Would you have a seat in the witness stand there, please? All right, for the record, state your full name.
Keith Taylor,
And where do you reside, Mr. Taylor?
Cleveland, Ohio,
And what do you do for a living?
property manager.
Mr. Taylor, did you grow up in the Cleveland area?
Yes,
In what part of town did you grow up?
east side of town.
East Cleveland?
East Cleveland, yes.
Can you generally describe that neighborhood for the jury?
I hate to use these words, but it's the ghetto of ghettos, if you will.
Not a nice place.
Not a nice place.
Now, you at one time worked as a mortgage broker, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
For how many years were you in that profession?
Wow, almost 12 years.
Now, how were you compensated as a broker?
Under the table, per commission.
What do you mean under the table per commission?
Cash.
And who would compensate you?
The mortgage company, the owner of the company, I would say.
And how was the amount of cash determined?
On the loan amount, based on the loan amount.
So the higher the interest rate, the bigger the cash payment you receive.
That's it.
Am I correct in assuming that some of the loans that you placed were subprime loans?
Yeah.
How would you define subprime?
Subprime loans are loans that you would do for somebody if what the banking industry wouldn't call creditworthy. You know, if somebody had bad credit, that's a subprime loan.
How do the interest rates under a subprime loan compare to the interest rates charged on a conventional loan that you'd get from a bank?
They would almost be double.
So they were higher.
They were definitely higher.
So your compensation was higher when you placed a subprime loan.
Yes.
And how did you get your clientele?
Truly, you know, just out in networking, and then I had a lot of referrals from my previous business.
And from your observation, how do these other brokers come into contact with their clientele?
Truly picking up the phone book, flipping to the letter J and finding the first person, what name you think is cute, and you call somebody and, you just cold call. I don't know how else to explain what a cold call is. You just you call somebody randomly, just because.
Did you ever encourage a prospective borrower to provide false information?
No.
On an application?
No.
Are you personally aware, from your own knowledge, whether other brokers did that?
No name calling, but the guy that I was actually in the mortgage business with, he would, because of the relationships we had with the banks, it was pretty much what I say goes. So he would, he could tell somebody to say, okay, well, you need to make $2,500 a month in order for this loan to get done. Well, this person only makes $1,400 a month. And, you change that 1 to a 2, the banks don't care.
Was this something that happened in an isolated incident, or was this a pervasive practice?
Not too sure what that word pervasive means.
Did it happen more than once?
It happened more than once, yes.
Didn't the banks come back and challenge that false information when the application was submitted?
Dude, they didn't care. They just wanted to buy the loan, and, it was business for them. And more than likely, they would have bought the loan and sell it to another bank anyway. So they didn't really pay that much attention, so that's how the folks were able to falsify the information.
Thank you. I have no further questions, Your Honor.
Cross-examination, Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Taylor, did you ever believe that some of these customers that were coming to you, that they were pursuing a dream with respect to owning a house that was unrealistic?
Okay, say it one more time.
Did you ever get the impression with customers that you dealt with, including, for example, customers who called you on the telephone, that they were seeking a bigger house they could really afford, they were biting off more than they could chew?
Don't we all do that, though? At some point, yeah, you do question it, but once again, just like I told him, if you tell me you can afford it and I got all my ducks in a row, then it is what it is. And once I present it to the bank and they say, okay, then what am I supposed to do? Yeah, sometimes I would feel like, okay, well, you know what? Can you really afford this? But I can only ask that question so many times.
You testified on direct examination that sometimes a borrower would say, well, I make $1,400. I think that was the example you gave, a month.
Okay.
So you testified that other brokers, not you, but other brokers would encourage them to put down $2,500. You understand?
Right, now I understand.
And that's true, right? That happened? You know that happened?
That happens, yeah.
Did anybody ever tell people in your office that that was a federal crime to do that?
Not to my knowledge, no.
No.
Because they kept doing it. And once again, if it's there in black and white and the banks are getting it, the banks are buying it.
You said the banks don't care.
Well, I don't really know if they care or not, but I do know one thing, that if I sign a document and I give it to them and they buy it, and they know more information than a mortgage company itself knows.
Now, how would they know more information, sir?
There's the bank.
What, are banks God, sir?
No.
Don't they have to rely on the accuracy of the information they're getting from the borrower?
Right.
And from?
And in the same way, I have to rely on the accuracy of the information that I'm getting from the client.
I understand that. I'm not asking about you. I'm saying, you're saying the banks don't care, and I'm saying they have to rely. They're getting thousands of these applications. Isn't that correct?
All day, every day.
Okay.
And the more they get, the more they look at it and say, all right, fine. And the more they get, the more money they make.
And the more loan applications the brokers process, the more money they get, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So when you said the banks don't care, you didn't know that to be a fact. The truth is, sir, that you don't care. The brokers don't care, right? You don't care whether the bank knows or doesn't know.
That's not it. That's not it.
Because the important thing for you was, as you testified, you got to eat.
Yeah.
Right?
I got to eat.
Yeah. And you wanted to get out of that ghetto of ghettos that you testified about.
And I got out, but it was the right way. Now, my colleagues, I can't speak for them.
That's it. No further questions. Thank you very much.
Quiet, please. And redirect, Mr. Combs.
Thank you, Your Honor. Now, you did come from that ghetto of ghettos, East Cleveland, right, Mr. Taylor?
Yes.
And a lot of the loans that your firm were placing when you were working as a mortgage broker came from East Cleveland, right?
Yes.
So there were high earnings coming to the banks from East Cleveland, the ghetto of ghettos.
Yes.
Bank would have a reason to question, wouldn't it, whether these high salaries from the ghetto of ghettos were kosher, wouldn't they?
Yes.
Bank ever get in touch with you or anyone from your firm and say, you guys better be careful about the information you're getting
No.
from your borrowers in East Cleveland?
No.
They still were approving loans from East Cleveland, right?
Yes, I would say so.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor. I have no further questions.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor. You can step down, sir.
It was moving because, first of all, I recognized the age you were and the age you are now. And to walk into that courtroom and know where that audience stands, know where those people are. A lot of them been hurt or mistreated. And to tell the truth, to speak out like that, that takes a lot of heart, that takes a lot of guts. Because some people were gonna look and, you know, wave you off or whatever. But that also gave me confirmation that what we said was happening was truly happening. I really do thank you for that. Thank you.
Alors, Cleveland.
So, Cleveland. And we just saw this expert. We can talk about it later, put it in context later. But to continue along the lines that we were following before we actually showed this excerpt, at the outset, this is misfortune that has led, major misfortune that has led to what we've just seen. Well, I'll go through this very quickly, but I wanted to film the trial that was ongoing in that courtroom. It's the idea is that the economy is more important than politics. So I was thinking, how can we talk about the economy? Can we talk about capitalism? Things were very vague in my head on this, so I spent a lot of time trying to find a place where these forces could be at play. A story, a place, yes, says the moderator, because we did research we were all over the world, traveling all over the world, looking at banks and so on, but it never found a place where I could incarnate these this sort of thing. And all of a sudden I see this ad that talks about Cleveland suing banks, and Swiss banks are involved. So I went to the place, had a look. I met with Josh Cohen, who was the attorney for the city, for Cleveland. I was waiting for this trial. I had to cut short my vacation. I don't take much vacation, and I was told, yes, it's starting, but it didn't start. So I started another film in the city with a number of protagonists that we met, people who had lost their houses because their houses had been repossessed, and a judge was evicting a number of people. A police officer. We filmed all of this. I think it took about 6 or 7 months before the trial actually started. And it was on the 31st. I remember on the 31st of December, the Obama campaign for his first term was ongoing at the time. We, in fact, ran a sequence with all the protagonists who were waiting for the 31st of December at home. And then immediately after this, that involved many people, I called my producer and I said, this is not what I want to do. This is not the kind of movie. I'm getting lost in this. I want to film the trial. Actually, this is why and so we're going to have to organize this trial ourselves, in other words. And this is how the idea of the film germinated. Actually, it was on the basis of, it was on the foundation, the rubble, if you will, of another film. And it's Robert Bonner, who was the second brain of this film, starting at that moment, because we had, I remember, in 2 or 3 afternoons, we had the whole sequence of witnesses. So this was a chain going from the families to the brokers, and then from the brokers to the banks and so on, because the sequence we've just seen, in fact, yes, there are 8 witnesses speaking in term, and in fact, they're saying there was a crime that was committed in Cleveland and what actually happened. Yes, this is also, well, we mentioned earlier the codes for political representation, but the abstracting the subprime crisis, there is a very clear picture. I think it's a black and white shot, which received the World Press Prize in 2009. It was the cover of Time magazine, I think, and it was used because a trial, in fact, is reporting. It's everything that comes out of the 17th century theater, unity of time, and so on and so forth. And in a trial, we have evidence, and the evidence in the case of Cleveland is this image of a police officer or police officers who quickly enter a house with their the owners of the house had been expelled because they were not able to pay their loan, and the police enter there with gun in hand, and so we have this figure of the enemy, and that's your starting point, I think. Well, let's just say that the film was born out of all of the meetings that I was able to arrange while we were there, and there was one film which became the emblem. It was the on front page New York Times. It was a Cleveland police officer who enters a room, enters a house, and when we saw him, he actually broke down and cried and said, "I had to do terrible things. I forced older ladies out of their homes, expelled them, and so on, evicted them." So the idea is to capture people who experimented, who experienced something, and we can ask them to relive this experience. They need to be supported here. And I remember when they came in, because everybody had to swear that they would tell the truth and the whole truth and nothing but the truth, just like in a normal trial. And that was a compact, in a way, between the witnesses and the attorneys. So it was very real, because I would tell people, you have to try to convince the jury. That's why you've come to testify. And this person broke down, cried. It was very important that I was able to find and bring out something that had happened, and we were able to see this. It was unexpected. Some of the things were unexpected, but all of this testimony had been prepared for each of the attorneys. I made a summary of the witnesses, and each one was, in fact, we were dealing with, we had 2 real lawyers who would carry out the cross-examination, trying to find the truth. First, there would be a witness testifying, and then there would be a redirect or a cross-examination. It gave us a better idea of things. But this is typical of the Anglo-Saxon legal system, isn't it? It has generated a sub-genre in the fiction movies. I suppose you have seen many films of trials. Yes, I wanted to film the lawyers eating pizzas at 4 a.m. that they had ordered, preparing everything. I had many films in mind, and I wanted to be able to do this because I admired many of these films that were about trials. And after that very, very long work, 2 years later, finally, well, it was probably 2 or 3 years of research, actually, in all. And the film was actually shot in 9 days. Just to say that sometimes what you expect for a very, very long time with an enormous amount of passion, well, the culmination of this can sometimes be just a 9-day shoot. We had a couple of cameras that were filming live these witnesses, and sometimes we had a camera that was hidden behind the witness. Sometimes you can see it. Can you say, some of the moderators speaking, can you say something? Because in fact there is some part of fiction here. Hirsch worked with Champetier and Barbarossa, and was this something that you intended to do, to be doing this sort of thing, somebody from the fiction side? Because there are some shots that are taken, some angles, where there was something that tried to respect the rule of field against field, and then there's a special kind of film stock which was very granular, and the whole technical setup is aiming at a fictional environment within a documentary. So everything that happens during these 9 days that you just mentioned are documentary situations, but there's that fictional element. Yes, well, it's very, very conventional, because in a documentary often there's some confusion, but here there's not much theory, but the public, we don't actually know that there are some very well identified narrative modes, one in particular, which was a narration where we're creating a situation which is going to lead to or generate a situation which is a reality which is produced, and that is the reality that is created, which becomes really the core of the film. We said at the outset that this is a fictional process which will take place in a courtroom in Cleveland. Everything was transparent, but everything that took place in this theater, which was completely set up, and it became a place where there was truth, a place of truth. So we're picking up that idea there, where nobody actually intervenes here. There's a transparent effect. The protagonists are up to their own devices. Sometimes I stepped in just to put a question once again, to be absolutely certain that things were clear, but it was given just to make sure that everyone was well understood. And then there was a sort of a debrief. There are those scenes outside the trial, the courtroom, where sometimes I put a question, and in the sacred courtroom area, we are in a moment which becomes the film's moment. And I think that all of this incredible research that we did earlier made it possible for us to get everyone together. We knew many, many people. We were very familiar with many of the situations. So we created all sorts of situations where people, they came and they were able to act as members of the public, as members of the jury. Well, yes, we can see this, and perhaps there was a reality effect for the spectator, for the viewer, and those who are there, for the jury, because they listened very, very closely to what happened. Because you have to imagine that we were practically live, because the crisis had just occurred. It was a world crisis that should have been a local crisis, but in fact became, through this speculation, which is completely crazy, became a world event, a world crisis.
I placed a lot of trust in the testimony of the witnesses. It really was the metaphor of a crime. There had been a crime, and we were seeking to find the people who were guilty. We were kind of trying to establish the crime scene, and then we tried to trace things back to the political responsibility. What about the introductory part of the film? When you showed the film the first few times, they said former drug dealer from the Eastern District of Cleveland who became a mortgage broker. That's not possible. We don't believe that. Yes, says the filmmaker, I did not want to reveal the theatre side of it. I wanted to plunge the audience into this. It was obvious that we had to give people all the keys in order to be able to project themselves into the fiction of the film. And I was pretty lucky because there were some quite dangerous places. In fact, we had a bodyguard during some of the filming. At the time, there were more than 300 murders a year in Cleveland. There were some really dangerous places, so there was someone with us to protect us. And it's thanks to him that we met Keith. He was a former drug dealer, and he'd switched from dealing in drugs to dealing in mortgages. And as he says at one point, I was a great drug dealer, and now I'm a great mortgage dealer because dealing is my business. And when people came along and saw him playing, they were saying he could have been an actor in New York. Well, obviously, we did not want the film viewers to have any doubts. We really wanted them to subscribe to what they were seeing. So I think we did not just go out and say we're going to make this film in Cleveland. There was a long process that we went through before we decided. So we had 2 cameras on tracks. So when we were shooting the person who was replying, we concealed the other camera. So it was a kind of game. We kept the cameras at the same distance so as to give the impression of creating these 2 dialogues. Well, it's getting late, says the moderator. Would anyone in the audience like to ask a question or questions? As it's getting pretty late at this stage of the discussion, please feel free to ask a question. There are 2 roving mics, which you will have to wait for, please, before asking your question. This is off mic. The interpreters unfortunately cannot hear. Apparently the roving mic doesn't work. Good morning and thank you. Thank you also to our 2 sign language ladies who are standing the whole time and don't even have a glass of water. I would like to ask you whether you have shown the Blocher documentary to Mr. Blocher himself when it was finished. At the time, there were no drones. Did you use a helicopter to film the Blocher experience? You knew the plan of the workshop. Well, we're going to show the Blocher film in a moment. I just have a follow-on question as you're there. This concerns the question of announcing the setup at the beginning of the film. I think you did tell us that you had done some pieces of cardboard to announce the setup of the film. Did you say this in the cardboard notices? What did the text of the cardboard notices say? Well, we did refer to this as Mr. Bron. Well, there's a voice which apparently is very neutral. In fact, it's my voice which explains things. They say that there are 100,000 people who are heavily indebted in Cleveland. The lawyers want to start a court case, and this is basically what we described in these on these pieces of cardboard, these cardboard notices. And then we had a kind of red thread. That's Barbara Anderson. The first thing that she says, first thing a character says. Again, this comes back to the desire of the character. A good documentary, a Swiss-German speaking filmmaker told us is good documentaries when you want to say something, or when the film wants to say something. No, Barbara was aware of all the crime-related problems in Cleveland. She said, I want to know the truth. So it's with her that we go into this theatre-like space, and we're going to try and understand what happened. And each character is presented in their own, in terms of their own desire. Josh is presented as someone who wants to do justice to the city of Cleveland. And the lawyer is really a lawyer who has spent his whole life working as a lawyer for banks. But he was a fictitious character because we really asked him to come along and play this role. You can see the film tomorrow. The film will be projected tomorrow, will be screened tomorrow. There is one further question. Thank you. It concerns corn in Parliament. At a certain point, you're filming plotting. Some of the characters are shown in a light which is not very favorable. Have they ever asked you afterwards to cut out the dialogue which you had filmed and the sound of which you had recorded and which was not very favorable to them? Do they have the right to correct or alter what they said? How does this relate to your filming rights, and how do you handle that type of thing if characters make this request of you? Answer. Well, normally now we have to get people to sign a document in which they sign away their rights to the image, but legally it does not have that much value. It has a certain amount of value if there should be a legal dispute afterwards. It would have a certain amount of weight if there were to be a legal dispute afterwards. That would give the filmmaker a bit more of a right. But the right to the image is inalienable. And so each time I take the risk, when we finish shooting and do the editing, I never remember that anyone ever told me that they wanted to have the right to cut something out. But sometimes they do, but they don't relate to problems which I might have anticipated, which I would have expected. Sometimes people don't like the sound of their own voice because they're hearing their own voice for the first time. Sometimes people just want to just adjust their tie and things like that. But often people really find it unbearable to hear the sound of their own voice for the first time. So you really have to identify what the problem is, and to try and go part of the way with them and convince them. I've never really been asked specific questions about a specific scene, although sometimes I've had to really sit tight when the film was being shown. Follow-up question. So even after the film had been shown, no one came back to you? No, says the filmmaker, because I work on the principle that people are sufficiently aware of the Corn in Parliament film, which I'd started filming with a very small camera. And in fact, this little camera gave the impression that we were maybe going to steal some illicit shots, that we were going to capture things on camera. But we very quickly got rid of that camera, and we came along with the largest model we could find at that time, so that people really knew that we were filming. And when I do the sound, I use the sound. I'm using the sound boom, and of course they can see the microphone is in place. So they realize that when the sound boom is in place, we are filming. When it's not in place, we're not filming. And of course they see the clap. Once the microphone comes along, there's a kind of actor's effect. In other words, the actor feels that he or she has to perform in full knowledge of the facts, and I work on the principle that those people who have performed something realize that this performance belongs to them. But usually we've spent quite a lot of time on it, and the contract is clear enough for them to know that this performance belongs to them. But of course, sometimes you might find yourself in a tricky situation. Sometimes people go further than what they wanted to do. But I've never been asked after the event to cut out certain scenes or acts. Question: are the characters in your documentary remunerated as actors? Answer: No, except in Cleveland, because that's a very standard practice in the United States. Very few documentaries are shot without remunerating the actors. The US documentaries are highly standardized. You cannot film in the street because otherwise people would be able to start a court case against you. So often there is a very highly standardized grammar which and set of rules which governs the filming of documentaries. We had determined an hourly rate for, we determined an hourly fee for people who came along, the witnesses, the lawyers, and we paid a meal for them. But some of the people were very poor, and so we had to compensate them for their loss of earnings, the loss of earnings that they sustained by coming along to film with us. But we decided on this once everything else was in place. But that was not what made them decide to come along and participate. They had other reasons. They, for example, in The Way I Look at You, in the film The Way I Look at You about driving schools, we often offered to pay for to fill up their car with petrol, and either to the instructor or to the pupils. That's something we did afterwards. Once we'd already chosen the actors, they did not come along because up front we told them, you're going to get a free tank of gasoline. But in Cleveland, things were more precisely defined. Question: there is a lot of humanity in the films that we've seen this morning. I also saw your film about the brain at a film festival in Belgium. Do you ever stay in touch with your various characters? Answer: well, it depends on the situation. There are some cases like in Cleveland, a lot of people became friends. When Trump was elected, we did an evening in which we grieved about that. What's more difficult is that what's more important is to urgently create a situation of trust, because you have very little time initially. That's what's at stake, the creation of this link. It's not always very easy to say goodbye, to stop, because we've shone the spotlight on these people. They've really contributed something to the film and to us. And sometimes it's not very easy to say goodbye to our characters. So there's a whole process of gradually saying goodbye. We gradually say goodbye little by little to our characters. Thank you. Another question? Are there any other questions before we continue? Simple question. Do you have techniques to prevent undesired camera shots, unwanted camera shots? Has that ever happened? It's a great question, says Mr. Bron. Yes, it's extremely annoying when it does happen. When I'm doing the sound, well, except on a few rare occasions, when I was purely the in a different role, well, it would bother me if that happened. I mean, you have to see that each person has their own role. They do something, we do something. They know when the microphone's in place, they know when we're shooting, they always know that. So by being there, I get a kind of legitimacy. I have a role. And it's true that when people interrupt this by making signs, I tell them, listen, we're doing our job, we're doing our work. Just let us do our job. So often the camera can be problematic when we're doing the sound. People tend to look at you, and I try to get people to look at the camera as much as possible so that I don't appear to be the sound taker. It's like the position of the journalist, who is very off-center in relation to the camera. That gives the impression that he's off-screen. So the further away the actor is from the spectator, the more there is a transparency effect. But you really have to face up to the camera, and it's often very difficult for people to do that, but there are some people who do that fairly easily. Often I hide myself. I hide as close as possible. I just keep one eye open so that people can keep contact with me, but I try to get them to be as close as possible to the lens. But you don't choose between the sound engineer and other scenes in which I'm off-center in relation to the camera. I try to place myself at 45 degrees so that people are not tempted to come and look at me. And of course, the actor always asks afterwards, is what I did good? Is it what you were expecting? Not everyone does this, but that's a moment that sometimes happens, and then we reassure people by showing them what's good and what's less good. Well, when actors have done something, when characters have done something which is not quite right, I tell them that it's not quite right. But I try to get them to be as true as possible, true to themselves as possible. And I try to get people to say that they were comfortable with their performance. We will have a second round of questions right at the end of this workshop. Just one last question for this question round. I cannot remember what the impact of the Cleveland film was about the people of Cleveland. Did that enable them to get a trial after all? What in general is the impact that your films have on the people you film? And as regards Cleveland, well, there's one thing I regret, and that is that 2 years later, the mayor of Cleveland wrote a letter to Josh Cohen. It was a superb letter explaining why it was important to do this trial, even if he lost. And I regret that I found this letter, or received this letter, when the film had already been shot. It tells us how, starting from this financial disaster, despite that, a lot of people met one another. And the film that I initially started making before this one, some people wanted to set up a collective bank, and so this kind of film and shooting the film gives people a lot of ideas. This film ends on a very pessimistic note about politics, about the ability of politics to control economic forces. Roughly, it says nothing has changed, and that all this trial served no purpose because there was no judgment, no one went to prison, so the final note was rather pessimistic. But this letter would have enabled us to say, well, it was not a completely pessimistic note on which we ended, thanks to this letter. So there was not a lot of impact, but nevertheless there were some effects. Some things did happen in Cleveland as a result of the film. Moderator. The film is also a kind of consolation prize, is it not? Jean-Stéphane Bron, it's a reward for us when you see things like Josh Cohen, who, despite his faults and his shyness, he nevertheless acted in the film, and he became a hero for that. So there was a kind of repairing effect. Well, of course, there was no major impact on Wall Street itself, for example. We would have known about it if it had, says the moderator. I have two questions I would like to ask you. First concerns the equipment. First of all, I love sound in your films. It's absolutely incredible in the circumstances that you have to face. It's incredible to have such clear sound. My question is, do you have some equipment which you like a lot, which you always use, or did you change the camera and the sound situation, sound system to match the situation? To change them to match the situation. It was really great in Cleveland. My second question is, when you are shooting abroad, as in Cleveland for you, what about the quality of the dialogue? Dialogue was wonderful in English. Do you do that dialogue yourself, or do you employ someone who is an English native speaker to help you with editing in cases like that? Those are my two questions. Well, they were not dialogues that were written. That's clear to you. Each one tells their own truth. They were not pre-written dialogues. Well, the dialogues are not too complicated. It's something which is fairly easy to edit. We did not have an English mother tongue editor. We managed to familiarize ourselves with what the people were saying. Well, the sound doesn't change very much. The camera setup changes a lot. You just have to experiment with things in life in each situation. But in Cleveland, the choice of the camera really does change things each time, the optics. And in Cleveland, we gave ourselves the possibility of being able to zoom in on situations depending on the level of emotion. And we said it had to be important. It was important that there should be a zoom, and we looked for the ideal camera for that. Obviously, the price is also important. And Cleveland, in the courtroom, there were so many sounds going on. I could not do it on my own. We had several sound boom guys and a sound engineer who was there with an enormous device. We did not have time to position HFs. We wanted people to really come into the courtroom and then not have any interruption anymore. We wanted the ritual to be respected. And since people really swear on the Bible, that sacralizes the moment. We did not want to say to people, listen, you have to take off your HF and then we will use the boom. So this was a big challenge for the sound boom guys. And it was quite a performance for the team as well. We really wanted it to be silent theatre. We whispered to each other. Although, in fact, we were a team of about 100 people. But it was a very intimate atmosphere on a small scale. And had this dialogue, but at the end there was an enormous concentration, because you have the extras and the members of the team. When we had lunch each day, there were more than 100 of us. I was not very clear when I talked about the equipment. Which camera do you use? Do you use a specific camera? And with the dual system of sound and camera, do you have two separate systems, two different systems, or do you try to simplify what you choose to shoot the scene? So I was talking more about the camera-related details. Well, to be honest, I don't remember what type of camera it was. I remember, says the moderator. I can no longer tell you what make of camera it was. But for the sound, it was, we used a sound boom and not HF. It's a Sony 2XY fitted with their original boom. So the brand was Sony, brand of the camera. You also talked about different types of camera. Well, it's getting late, so I suggest that we continue with another kind of workshop in motion with an experiment that you're going to discover now, or at least partially. with, let's see now, excerpts 7 and 9, please. 7 and 9.
Ob sie geschehen, das ist ja nicht zu fragen. Die Perle jeder Fabel ist der Sinn.
La première fois que je vous ai rencontré, vous m'avez dit « Je ne me connais pas, je ne sais pas qui je suis, je ne m'observe jamais, je suis un homme d'action. Pourquoi je suis comme je suis, je ne sais pas, mais ça m'intéresse de le savoir. Comme c'est vous qui faites le film, je ne peux qu'espérer que vous le ferez avec honnêteté. » Vous avez ajouté « Il vaudrait peut-être mieux attendre que je sois mort pour faire un film sur moi. » Voyez Mozart, on l'a oublié pendant 150 ans, puis on l'a redécouvert. Vous avez l'air un peu inquiet, vous craignez que je vous montre comme le diable. Je vous réponds que vous n'êtes peut-être pas le diable, mais pas un ange non plus. Alors vous voulez montrer comme je suis vraiment? J'ai eu l'inspiration de vous répondre comme un homme. En voyant votre visage intrigué, j'ai compris que j'avais mon ticket d'entrée. Mais comment faire le portrait d'un homme dont on ne partage ni les idées, ni les méthodes, ni les convictions? Vous êtes à la tête du Schweizerische Volkspartei, le parti suisse du peuple, l'Union démocratique du centre en français. Un parti bourgeois et conservateur selon vous, un parti de la droite radicale, nationaliste et populiste selon la plupart des observateurs. En quelques années, votre parti est devenu la première force politique du pays. Pour d'autres mouvements en Europe, vous faites figure de modèle. Je regarde votre visage avec le sentiment de regarder mon pays sous un angle que je ne connais pas. Vous êtes pourtant une figure centrale de notre inconscient collectif. Raconter votre histoire, c'est raconter notre histoire. C'est explorer notre ombre.
Vier Jahre nach seiner Abwahl aus der Regierung bereitet Christoph Blocher seine große Rückkehr vor. Die Partei des Zürcher Volkstribuns strebt vor allem im Ständerat Sitzgewinne an. Steht Blochers Wahlkampf im Zeichen der Revanche?
Ja, nicht mal verschiedene Briefe anrufen wegen dem. Ja, das ist aufs alle Liebe hören. Wegen dem NZZ-Interview ist es Fotos. Ja. Ja, wir nehmen die Variante 1 und 2 streichen wir. He? Und dann kannst du es so abschicken, ist in der Ordnung. He? Jawohl, ja. Ja. Das ist ein bisschen zu lang. Nehmen wir die kürzer, die Variante 2. He? Und das ist Mathe Dimanche. Jawohl, ja. Mathe Dimanche machst 2, dann kann man nicht streichen, wenn die Einverstanden sind, ist der Bericht. Also, ich habe noch etwas, aber komm auf dich zu. He? Ciao, leb wohl. Ja, Christoph Blocher. Ja, Sally. Du kommst echt wegen meinem Inserat, den du mir geschickt hast. Ja, bin nicht glücklich. Weißt du, es geht um ein Wahlkampf-Inserat. Wir müssen da nicht Reklame machen für Parfüm. Da muss ein bisschen etwas drin sein. Und was halt immer ist, wir haben einfach zu wenig Varianten. Wir müssen doch mit einer klaren Botschaft ein bisschen Varianten liefern.
Liebe Mitlandsleute, es ist der 1. August 2011, der 720. Geburtstag von unserem Heimatland. Jedes Land hat Mythen und alles, was in der Geschichte gross ist, gibt es einen Mythos. Und statt das drüber lächeln, sollten wir es haben wie der grosse Zürcher Dichter, der Gottfried Keller, der gesagt hat, ob sie geschehen, ist hier nicht zu fragen. Die Perle jeder Sage ist der Sinn. Der Kern von allen Völkersagen ruht hier frisch darin. Er hat es in Bezug auf die Geschichte von Wilhelm Tell gesagt. Und der Gotthard oben, das Monument vom Widerstand, von der Selbstständigkeit, das muss uns Mahnmal sein und Denkmal gleichzeitig. Bleiben wir uns selber und tun wir nicht das unterwandern, was unsere Stärke ist. Schauen Sie, wenn es der Schweiz besser geht, ist es, wie gesagt, die Direktdemokratie und dass wir nicht in dieser EU sind.
Je vous filme alors que l'Union européenne s'enfonce lentement dans une crise économique et politique majeure qui menace son existence. Si la Suisse ne fait pas partie de cette tragédie, si la Suisse ne fait pas partie de l'Europe ni de cette histoire, c'est à cause de vous. Il y a 20 ans, seul contre tous, vous êtes partis en croisade. Contre les milieux économiques, contre le gouvernement et le Parlement, contre une fraction de votre propre parti, contre la presse social-démocrate, contre la presse de gauche, contre la presse bourgeoise. Vous avez fait campagne contre l'intégration de la Suisse à l'espace économique européen. Pour tenter de remporter cette bataille qui semblait perdue d'avance, vous vous tournez vers le peuple. En quelques mois, vous prononcez plus de 200 discours. Vous me racontez qu'à l'époque, chaque nuit, vous faites le même rêve. Une montagne s'effondre et vous êtes le seul à essayer de la retenir. J'entends, la Suisse s'effondre et j'essaie de la retenir. Dans votre cauchemar, les rochers et la boue finissent par vous submerger. Chaque nuit, vous vous réveillez en sueur.
Alors autant dans Cleveland, on se trouvait...
Well, any narrational system has to identify victims so that the story can be more believable or better, in fact, where it's constructed in a better way. There's the figure of the bad guy, lawyer, and Blocher, you as the director, you can potentially become the victim of the leader that you are portraying. That's why I decided to show the opening, because it shows aesthetically what is involved here. From the very first scene, there is this mysterious imaginary system. We're somewhere between a fable and a story, and this is the first time in your filmography where you were so much in the scene, but through the voice, through your voice, and that you are also portraying the character who is the protagonist and who has to be caught within your story. So I want to know, how did you manage to film the body of the enemy? I'll use this mic. Well, once again, here, I didn't want to say we can apply a rule and say this is how it should be done. We wanted to start on the basis... Well, let me put it this way. What was very clear at the very outset was that there would be a narration commentary as a counterpoint to the space that I was going to provide, filming someone. The fact that I'm filming means that it's a machine. It's a machine. Cinema is a machine that creates empathy. I think we substitute someone. We could substitute a fish, a creature, a politician. So we become that person. We literally in the shoes of that person, and it creates this relationship. I wanted the spectator, the viewer, to always be connected to the film through this voice. That was the starting point. The other thing was someone who has the biggest collection of portraits. Anker is a painter who painted portraits. Anker, and well, this is the Switzerland that we no longer see, really. Well, yes, the Federal Council at the time sent Anker letters saying that you're filming a Switzerland that will not exist. You are painting, rather, not filming, but painting. So I'm putting myself in this position of the painter. We have to find a place, so we were in his vehicle. The idea was to spend time with him. And another rule that we had at the outset was that it was not be an interview. I was not going to ask him questions. I had this feeling that we had already put all of the most difficult questions, the most personal, close-up questions, and this wasn't the best way of doing things. In addition to this, I really was not interested in meeting him through language, to the extent that I was convinced that the problem of populism, there's a problem in the language itself. The language there's a corruption of the language, which means that one can never agree on the subjects. So the film starts with what it often mentions, Gottfried Keller, and that is where the legend is more interesting than the reality. I think that's the case here. The idea is that what is real is not the most important thing. It's the story that we're going to make of it, and that story is going to become the story. can see how, in spite of the Bergier report about neutrality, how World War II, the history of World War II is being rewritten. And I said, that's not really the question. It's a more case of saying, this is a portrait. It's a painting. And the second thing that happened, and I wasn't aware of this at all in the beginning, is that, and something developed during the whole process, that it would be a sort of a psychoanalysis. There's a political figure at the center of the film, but it's something where the question of destiny, the making of Christoph Blocher, how did we get to this point, and how did we reach this point ourselves with the common consciousness, and this idea happened. It was pure happenstance. We found and did some research. I went to the village and I checked some information there about his father, who had been forced out of the village, something that I talked to some of the older folks in the village, and there are many, many things there that I was very interested in when I went back in time and looked at his youth, and I discovered that Carl Jung, a contemporary of Freud, had actually lived in the same house on the shores of the Rhine. And in the memoirs, it was mentioned, we confronted the idea of psychoanalysis with the question that Jung poses on collective conscience, and to have this idea of the psychoanalysis of Blocher and our own thoughts about it. So it's not so much a film about him. Well, it's about him, but it's about our relationship to him. So this is something that I set forth at the beginning. I wanted to have the best possible sound in the vehicle. We had a very small camera, which allowed us to shoot for a very long time, and it became the center of the film. What I mean by center is, it's very important to ask ourselves the question, what is the center of the film? What is the focal point of the film? And it's not necessarily from a geographical point of view, but it's also the center for those who saw While the Green Grass Grows. The center can be in a relationship. Has nothing to do with the geography. It's not the geographical center. In other words, what is the essence? And if it is a relationship, well, then so be it. That is the whole purpose. We had a sort of a perimeter, the vehicle, an absence of relationship. I wasn't going to interact with him, but I was going to say something, just like the movie would become the commentary. Now, if you could connect this microphone here, if you could turn it on, the one I was holding, and that I put down on the table, it would help. Now, through this portrait, sometimes you actually are bringing him into the center of this. That's the sequence that we saw, the second excerpt that we saw. At what point in the shooting does this take place, where there's this trust or confidence linked is established, where you can actually have him in the foreground, and in this duel between a political animal such as Blocher, who hates the camera but actually feeds off of the camera, and you as the director, film director. It's also a power play, isn't it? The power of images, the image of power. Well, yes, it's true that here it's fairly obvious. We didn't just film this in the Cantonal Historical Museum of Zurich. It's something that we prepared. We had a meeting. So that's where we bring him in. And for me, I was trying to say that there is a sort of religion of images through sanctifying the withdrawal in Marignan, something which is extremely complex historically, but where one was supposed to bow before the Bailly hat, and And this has yielded fables. That was the meaning behind all of this. Also, to have this person become a figure. It's something that we work with the musician Christian Vertian, was it? Yes, where we get this idea that basically you were asking about the Western, the black hat and all that, and it's him when he saw the first editing said, well, yeah, through the editing, what if we try to do something like Ennio Morricone, music from the spaghetti westerns and so on, where we can really make clear the genre or what we're trying to find. And this here, it was a horror movie, a movie about vampires, Carpenter topics. So, also because this was a movie about fear and the fear of making a movie, I was actually petrified myself, terrorized when I talked about this, talking about Mozart and so on, comparing it to Mozart, rediscovered after such a long time. I remember that when I walked in, I had this panic attack, and I thought to myself, how can I possibly do this? And he said, well, it's absolutely impossible. We're never going to be able to do this. So there was the fear of him, the fear of making the film itself, that was at play here, this concern or fear. There was this fear throughout the film, I think, and it really was. It came out of Cleveland. The idea, just like Cleveland establishes that economic forces won in the end. As a result, there's a doubt about politics. We can talk about this again when we talk about images, but this doubt. Is who's going to be able to benefit from the crime, and we see that there's this fable, being able to work more on what is real and on feelings, and it was that the feelings and emotion are things that can be manipulated. So all of this was revolving around fear, and I was inspired by this. For the music, well, what about when the film actually came out? Were you criticized? There was sort of a buzz, wasn't there, about this? There were controversial reactions, I think, sometimes, in fact, fairly violent. Perhaps the mirror side of the film, since a film is always a mirror, the way people perceive it, perhaps some people didn't want to see them included in that collective conscience that you're talking about, using all of the tools of the trade. But in the end, through this movie, were you able to conquer your fear without being manipulated? Because it almost turned you into a vampire, I think, with a special effect. The person's putting cream on his face, moisturizing his face. Well, yes, digitally we were able to erase his image in the mirror, because we know the vampires don't have an image. We were tempted to do this, but we didn't actually erase his image, reflection. Well, he's putting on cream. It's almost as if he's going to step onto the stage, putting on his makeup, putting on his face. We didn't. It took a long time in that bathroom there, and we had to ask him, do you agree to be filmed and to have you walking through your living room, walking across the bathroom? And when I see him putting on some Nivea moisturizing cream, I've discovered all sorts of things, actually. And we're fairly far from this possibility of putting him in the scene and filming him in something as intimate as this. But it was very exciting to do this, to say, could you please lie in this way, put yourself in this position? But I, of course, knew very well that I I didn't know if I was going to win and to be successful. It was criticized, but I think that it was disturbing. It was a disturbing film, and I'm very well aware of this because it shows how this person has been invited to speak on television thousands of times. We actually looked into this, and this question of not actually engaging in a dialogue, not putting questions. And then afterwards, I thought we could have worked together on the question of words and images. That's very important for the describing a populist situation. And I would do the movie as it is now. There would be a first part that we could call a man, like a man, or the Blocher experience part 1, a man. And then there would be a second part of the film, and I think he would have liked this very much, to do this. But I didn't do it, in fact, because there is a film on McNamara that was done using that approach. Fog of War, correct. Yes. And I thought, I don't want to imitate Fog of War and that whole approach, where I would have had him alone in a room, almost as if he was a detainee in a room for several days, and have the Blocher experience, which would examine him and perhaps interrogate him as well, but with an interpreter, to go down into the room, into the prison, and say, look, if I show you this picture, what are you thinking of when I show you this? And what about this word? What connections do you make with this word? And to continue this experience all the way to the end, with the possibility of thinking with others to try to deconstruct a little more. And then there would have been a film, would be a 2-part film. I don't know if it would have been an excellent film, but that's how I would like to do it today. But we do have to finish up our movies at some point in time, unlike artists who can continue to paint and paint over their scenes and fiddle with their painting. I think it would be more accurate if we did it this way. So now we're really running out of time here. But after this Blocher experience, you're changing your approach completely. And once again, you're using a different tool.
Still on this topic of the workshop, because the Blocher experience really is your voice, this relationship, this pact between the filmmaker and the person being filmed. Now, when you shot the Paris Opera, there was a little bit of disappointment or disillusionment about what politics can still give rise to. And with the plan of immersive sequences, I think you were trying to find and observe a society at work from the top of it to the bottom of it, while renewing this motif of the backstage, which is a position you are particularly fond of, a location you're particularly fond of, and for the filmmaker's work. Answer: well, the Blocher film is highly constructed. Each shot has an idea behind it, and the construction does as well. And when I finished the film, I really had been quite badly affected by the 2 years that I'd spent with him. So I wanted to film a collective group at work, kind of troupe, in which democratic questions were raised in a different context. Of course, I could talk about class-related problems and so on, but we had a kind of common objective and a common perspective, which would have been difficult in the Blocher film. That's why I chose the opera film, the Paris Opera film. A proposition was made to me to make this Paris Opera film. And straight away I saw that there were possibilities for a film, because there was going to be a new director, a new head of the choral department, and so it's a very classical film. It's a film shot in immersion. There's no commentary. There are no interviews. And it's often this form that people generally associate with documentaries. It's the form in which there is no interaction with the social subjects. People forget about the camera and the actors, and you really are captivated by the film. In fact, I had never really done that type of film, a captivation film. Either I did not react, or there was a very restrictive setup. So here it was an immersion in a small society. 4 or 5 characters stand out. It was began to stand out. It was clear that we were going to follow them, but there was a long casting process in order to finally choose the right person, the right dancer. I had some ideas in my mind. I did not want to film a star dancer, but someone who was going to have her moment in the year. So we interviewed 50 or 60 dancers. Each one of them told us their story. One of them was injured, and so it was rather difficult. And she told me that this year she would probably only have about 3 minutes in the whole year in which she would be on her own on the stage. And the idea was to start out from opera and to find the right form, even though I'm by no means an opera specialist. Now, for opera, there is a relationship between the collective and the individual, and the film had to really try and capture that. So there was the relationship between the individual and the collective, and in opera there is music right from the first second, and well, there's music basically all the time. So we decided that the film would be like an opera. There would be those times when there were arias. Sometimes people would be alone on the stage. Then there would be other times when everyone would be there together collectively. So our rule from the start was it's not a film about the show, it's a film about the people who watch opera. And since we were backstage, off stage, the rule was that we are not going to see the show ourselves, but we're going to lend intentions to people like the ballet director, who was tense about the show. So we're going to see the show not directly, but through the eye of a spectator. So it was going to be in immersion, and there would be no interviews. And that's when I found Focal Fix. That enabled me to have this society at equidistance. We were exactly on the same footing with everyone. So the idea was to place everyone on an equal democratic footing, whether they were stars or not. Well, we will soon have to wrap up this masterclass. I would just like you to tell us something about your latest film for cinema. Your latest film. I know you're working on a project right now. It's a film which is going to be screened on Saturday here, about the one about the brain. Cinq Nouvelles du Cerveau, the brain in English. In fact, your films are always or often haunted by the question of power. How does power run through society? In fact, this runs through your films right from Corn in Parliament to the brain. Film after film, you register the functioning of society, how society functions, moving towards interests which are more and more privatized. But each time you do it by going through stories which are very human. In the brain, it's the relationship between an actor and his son. And another film, You think that the son is going to be even more radical than the father, but no, on the other hand, it's a son who belongs to a generation that is extremely radical. So you have those 5 characters there. Jean-Stéphane Bron, I think that if I had to film this, shoot this film again today, I would do it differently. The techniques were not the same then as they are now. I did the film in 2 parts. The first part as I shot it, so there's this relationship, the relationship between a father and his son, and then the son who's deprived of being able to express himself, unable to express himself. Then we have the dialogue between a scientist and his dog who's going to die, and relationship between a young apprentice and scientist talking about robotics. It was a film without any specific territory. Now, when you're not at the center of a territory, it's very difficult. When the filmer holds the camera and is at the center of the filming setup, then the territory becomes the space of the person who is looking at it. But there's always a perimeter, the perimeter of the person who's asking questions, who's walking around. Now, in the brain, I did not want to show myself at all. I devoted all the space to the protagonist. Even in the Cleveland film, there is not a space which embodies contemporary research about the brain, and not in the film about the brain itself either. The music mingled human choirs with synthetic music. I think the main difficulty of the film The Brain, which was very difficult to shoot, which has not been resolved to this day, is this idea that the initial question really was the question about democracy. There are some things today which we have seeded transnationally, internationally. For example, science, and there is a new place of power, a new location of power. I think this idea would have exploded in the film if we'd done it in 2 parts. First of all, the first part with the protagonists, their voices and so on. Then in part 2, we could have faked everything. I could have faked everything. Transformed the characters and put them in a different context and made them say things which they did not want to say because they were not there. I could have inverted everything. A bit like my internship film. We did not talk about it, says the moderator. That was done in 2 parts. First part, which was filmed, and then it was redone. But unfortunately, the right tools were not at my disposal at that point in time, as they had been for that film, The Way I Look at You. So it would have been better to do the film in this way. That would have raised the question of the image and our relationship with image and images. And the question of the archives, and that's also related to the whole meaning of this festival, and whether this will continue to be possible in future, and what is the proof. So it's quite a complex democratic question. To end the story, I believe Godard was the first one who sensed this when Photoshop arrived and said, this is horrible because we're going to be able to put geraniums on the doors of concentration camps, whereas of course they didn't have such a thing. So the question of the image as being the ultimate proof of something which has existed is going to be called into question, according to him. This is going to be very complicated to wrap up this workshop. I believe you're working on a diary of sketches at the moment. Maybe you could tell us a few words about that. Well, it's a film about a construction site. I thought that construction site was a good metaphor for present-day life after the COVID-19 pandemic, a world which is being rebuilt, reconstructed. So it's the reconstruction of a cinema, a theatre. It's a very big construction site which is going to be in operation for another year. It's already been in operation for 4 years. Now, to talk about this film, I thought I was going to be able to redo the Paris opera film about the way in which a group of people work, but the big difference between this film and the Paris opera film is that when a young dancer repeats, the dramaturgic purpose is already contained in the scene. You know why the people are there. You know that's very clear. In the evening, you want to go on stage, you want to be perfect, but the aim you want to achieve is the show when the curtain goes up. But when you prepare a job, everyone knows what their own function is. When you're casting concrete on a construction site, it's very difficult to dramatize this. And very quickly, I realized that this was going to be a film not about people and how they work and their relationship to work, but a film about our relationship with the film. So you can go from the most unskilled workers up to Renzo Piano at the top. It's a film about how you build cinemas, movie theaters. It's going to be a film about today's world, and it's a film which is pretty mixed. It involves mixed techniques. As plastic artists say, there are interviews, there are archives, and then there's a more open, more poetic form than what I've been able to do up to now. And by way of an anecdote, I think that's the purpose of documentary film. A person who is maltreated every morning and who has to break down walls. We see someone breaking a wall. People. So I asked a guy who spent his whole day breaking down walls. I asked him if he goes to the cinema at all, ever. And he said, yes, I go to the cinema in my village in Morocco. And he related one whole film to me. It's called the Atlas Cinema in his village, and it's now been demolished, but a few kilometers away from him in Meknes, there's a cinema which is very well known and which dates from the 1930s, which is also being renovated at the moment. And I said to him, it's a pity you didn't go to the camera cinema. And then he said, oh yes, but I did go there as well when I was studying maths and physics later, and I went to that cinema. I have a degree in maths and physics. And by asking him this simple question about his relationship with cinema, this gives rise to, gives us a whole load of new leads. So we went off to Morocco and to Meknes, and that then we asked people what they thought about film, about when they'd seen Top Gun and other films. And you can narrate quite a lot about a society just by focusing on the relationship between people and image and film. Then, of course, you have the movie theater as a place in which people meet collectively. We also found archives about workmen who go off to cinema clubs and where they find cinema as a politicization experience. And I would never have imagined to what extent this subject can open up a lot of worlds and can lead to topics which are extremely contemporary. Moderator, that's what we try to do here at Vision du Réel. Thank you very much indeed for having been so generous with sharing details about your instruments and devices that you use in filmmaking. Jean-Stéphane, and we wish you all the best for the project that you are working on currently, and we hope that we will be able to discover that film again in the future at a future edition of the festival. Thank you all, says Jean-Stéphane. Thank you all in the audience for having come along this morning.